This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Good morning. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa. Welcome to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. For the past few weeks, I've been spending a lot of time at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which has a tremendous collection of transit-related documents, and specifically related to the Union Traction Company and the Philadelphia Traction Company. These were two of the many companies that Peter Arrow Brown Widener had under his control and operated as part of his empire along with his colleagues that included William C. Whitney in New York and also Thomas Fortune Ryan. And they offer a fascinating look into the mechanics of how streetcars were operated first by horses from the 1860s until the 1880s, and then starting in 1895 or so, this vast empire in Philadelphia was converted to run on electricity. And this coincided with the explosive growth of housing in Philadelphia, in which vast middle and working class districts were built along the electrified streetcar routes in North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia. And every once in a while, you come across, as an historian, an occasional humorous bit of historical information and a familiar name, a name that I had come across earlier in my historical career. For many years, I was a blogger at phillyhistory.org, and I wrote a 3-part series on the Butler-Wister family of Germantown. There was a whole saga that included the British actress Fanny Kemble, who marries into the Butler family. The Butler family in the early 19th century were one of Philadelphia's wealthiest clans, but they also had extensive slave holdings and plantations in Georgia. And Fanny Kemble, the English actress, was so appalled by what she saw when she visited her husband's plantations that she wrote a diary, and eventually that got turned into a memoir that was not published until the Civil War. She eventually divorced Pierce Butler. And Pierce Butler, in 1859, to pay off his gambling debts, he conducted the largest slave auction in U.S. history up to that time, where almost 500 people, human beings, were sold, families were split up, and children were crying. It was called the weeping time in contemporary papers. And the grandchild of Pierce Butler and Fanny Kemble was the famous writer and Western novelist Owen Wister. Owen Wister was very, very close friends with Theodore Roosevelt. They knew each other at Harvard. And Owen Wister wrote what was arguably the first Western novel, The Virginian, which was inspired by his time in Wyoming when Owen Wister was suffering from tremendous depression, basically had a nervous breakdown after he had a failed career as a concert pianist and opera composer. His father, Dr. Owen Jones Wister of Germantown, said, "What a stupid career it is for you to be a composer and a pianist. I'm sending you to Harvard Law School." After law school, Owen Wister he got a job in a bank and despised it. And he went out west at the advice of Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, who advised wealthy young scions of Philadelphia families to go out west and spend time in Wyoming and do manly, active activities such as hunting. And Owen Wister was so inspired by his time in Wyoming and what he saw in the Wyoming cowboy that he began writing about it. So that's a connection that Philadelphia has with my father's home state of Wyoming. There's a long connection between Philadelphia and Wyoming that dates back to the time of Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell and Owen Wister. But getting back to what I found in the archives, I found a letter addressed from the second vice president and assistant general manager of the Union Traction Company, which controlled a huge segment of Philadelphia's streetcars, addressed to Owen Wister's mother, Sarah Butler Wister. And Sarah Butler Wister was a prominent resident of the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. She resided at the family's estate at Butler Place, which is where Owen Wister, her son, was brought up. And she herself was a very accomplished woman in her own right, the daughter of Fanny Kemble. She was an abolitionist in her youth. But she also was the author of several books. Among them included The Worthy Women of Our First Century, which she co-edited with Agnes Irwin, who was the first dean of Radcliffe College and the namesake of the girls' school on the Main Line. She also wrote Tabor and the Thames, their association's past and present, and also Walter Newhall, a memoir. So she was a very serious woman. She was married to a very prominent doctor. Oddly enough, it's interesting that she and her husband discouraged their son Owen from pursuing a career in the arts. But in July, she had written a letter to the Union Traction Company complaining about 2 rides she had on the Chelten Avenue Line. This was the electrified line that ran up and down Chelten Avenue, which was the burgeoning Germantown commercial corridor. It was, by the early 1900s, Chelten Avenue had become one of the most prosperous shopping streets in the city of Philadelphia, servicing the very affluent Germantown and Mount Airy neighborhoods. And so the old Mrs. Wister was traveling on one of these newfangled electric trolley lines, and she saw 2 things she didn't like, one of which she would not talk about. It must have been absolutely unspeakable. The second was about a passenger and tobacco. And in quick response, the manager, the assistant general manager of the Union Traction Company, who reported directly to Peter Widener, one of the richest men in town, he wrote back Mrs. Wister saying, "Dear Madam, we have your communication of July 5th referring to a passenger on car 366 of the Chelten Avenue line, also referring to a passenger carrying an unlighted cigar in the front seat of car 350. We thank you for the interest you have in the company's affairs in writing on these subjects, and the same will be taken up with our general superintendent." So interesting that Mrs. Wister took the time to complain about a passenger who was carrying an unlighted cigar. It wasn't even lit. And then who knows what happened on this other car, on car 366. It must have been pretty bad for no one to mention it. But just for some context, I mean, Mrs. Wister was someone who was born in the 1830s. And now, as a very old woman, she was now living in a world of electricity and traveling on a car that was now going at 15 to 20 miles an hour. And she probably had very old-fashioned standards in terms of how people were carrying themselves. She was probably not used to traveling on transit with people of various classes. But for some context, we also think that back in those days, people were very well behaved. According to literature of behavior of passengers on these newly electric streetcars, there's reports of people spitting on the floor. These cars were often cold during the winter, hot during the summer. They smelled bad. Male passengers would make pretty overt advances on women passengers. And I think there's this interesting dichotomy of what people expected back in those times and how people would behave. But then there was also the chaos of a rapidly industrializing and growing city. So Mrs. Wister clearly was someone of another age, and she had a very strong sense of how people should behave. Although it would be interesting to see how Mrs. Wister, her reaction would be on your typical Market Street elevated train today. And it was also just interesting to see and wonderful to see the name of someone who I'd researched in Philadelphia come up in just ordinary Union Traction Company correspondence. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you so much for listening to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. For more on the story of the Butler-Wister family, please check out my articles on phillyhistory.org, in which I write about the weeping time and Owen Wister's journey as a writer. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.